Now, as the Ukrainian crisis worsens, Western allies in Russia are engaged in a worst standoff since the Cold War, with the United Nations Security Council now calling for an emergency session for the second time this week. The meeting was requested by Kiev and is expected to vote on resolution condemning Russia over its decision to recognize two breakaway regions in Ukraine as independent.
Croatia.
Active diplomacy, strong political messaging, tough economic sanctions and strengthening Ukraine can still force Moscow to abandon aggressive plans. Swift and resolute actions by the United Nations can reclaim the organization's leading role at this historic and dark moment.
Russia remained defiant, with its envoy saying Moscow could not ignore the blatant genocide of Russian speakers in Donbass. Criticizing the United Nations Secretary General, Kremlin said that Guterres' remarks on eastern Ukraine were not in line with the UN Charter mandate.
В условиях неприкрытого геноцида и попрания главного права человека, права на жизнь, наша страна не могла более оставаться безучастной к судьбе 4-миллионного Донбасса. Мы руководствовались прежде всего тем, что высшая ценность – это человеческая жизнь. Критикуя нас за это решение, вы проявляете полное безразличие к судьбе дончан и луганчан, как это делали Киев и его западные кураторы все 8 лет конфликта. К нашему сожалению,
both Antonio Guterres and the United States dismissed Russia's allegations of genocide. The UN Secretary General called for an immediate ceasefire and return to dialogue to de-escalate tensions, while the Western allies demanded that the United Nations states reject Russia's action. United States, Britain and Germany called for isolation of Russia, urging UN to impose further sanctions to halt Kremlin hostility against Ukraine.
It's time for restraint, reason and de-escalation. There is no place for actions and statements that would take this dangerous situation over the abyss. It's time to establish a ceasefire and return to the path of dialogue and negotiations to save the people in Ukraine and beyond from the scourge of war.
We need to close ranks and strongly reject such action. If not, then what has hit Ukraine today could happen to other UN member states tomorrow.
China, meanwhile, called for restraint for all parties involved. Beijing noted that issue is rooted in a complex web of historical and current factors, and that Chinese envoy calling for joint action to uphold the principles of the United Nations Charter.
中方对乌克兰局势的演变表示关注。中国关于维护各国主权和领土完整的立场是一贯的。联合国宪章的宗旨和原则。
WION correspondent Susan Teherani has sent us this report from New York on the same. Let's listen in.
The United Nations General Assembly held its plenary meeting on the situation in Ukraine's occupied eastern territories. Now, while this was a pre-planned meeting, the latest developments in the Ukraine-Russia border dominated the gathering. For one thing, it came one day after Russian President Vladimir Putin decided to recognize parts of eastern Ukraine as independent and pulled Russian troops in that area. This caused UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres to state at the meeting that we meet in the face of the most serious global peace and security crisis in recent history, certainly in my time as Secretary General. He also said Russia's decision to recognize the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine they are violations of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and inconsistent with the UN Charter. Now, the Secretary General's remarks laid the groundwork for speeches made, for the most part, by other UN member states. When the Russian ambassador to the United Nations took the podium, he accused the United Nations of being influenced and swayed by the West and taking the side of the West, while the Ukrainian foreign minister, who is in New York and took part in this UNGA meeting in person, said that the Ukrainians have no intention of starting a war with Russia, but did call on the United Nations to act swiftly to prevent Russia from launching an all-out incursion into Ukraine. He also said that if the UN does not act swiftly, it would, quote, be the end of the world order as we know it. Susan Tehrani reporting from New York for WION World is One.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.